The night Father Dominic Ibarra drove home through the kind of rain that makes a man question his route choices. And perhaps his entire life, he had already endured what he privately called a full Tuesday of the soul. The cathedral's boiler had failed mid-mass. 3 parish council members had argued about the color of new hymnals for 45 minutes, and his nieces, Camille and Renee, had each called him separately within the same hour to ask for money he suspected would not go toward anything he would recognize as necessity. He was tired in the particular way that only a man carrying other people's lives can be tired, not in his bones, but somewhere deeper, in the place where hope is stored and occasionally runs low. He almost missed her entirely. Was tucked beneath the stone archway of St. Benedict's side entrance, a girl so slight that the shadows seemed to be holding her upright. She could not have been older than 17. Her clothes were soaked through, her arms wrapped around herself in the instinctive way of someone who had learned that comfort would not come from anywhere else. A small wooden rosary dangled from her left fist, and she was murmuring, not crying, murmuring words Father Dominic recognized after a moment as the Hail Mary, spoken in a rhythm so steady it sounded like breathing. He pulled the car over. He was a billionaire by inheritance, a priest by vocation, and a man by the particular mercy of God who had never once in 61 years been able to drive past something broken without stopping. His late brother Emeka had teased him about it relentlessly. "Dominic," Emeka used to say, "you would stop to help a lamp post if it looked like it had a bad week." He had not been wrong. Father Dominic stepped out into the rain without bothering with his umbrella, a gesture that was either holy or simply impractical, depending on who you asked, and crouched to the girl's eye level. Name was Sophia. She was 16. She was 4 months pregnant, a fact she disclosed not with shame but with the flat, exhausted honesty of someone who had already processed every available emotion on the subject and had arrived, finally, at the hard ground of survival. She had been raped by a man she had trusted. Her mother had not believed her. She had been in the street for 11 days. Father Dominic did not say much in that moment. He had learned long ago that words offered too quickly after pain feel like furniture rearranged in a burning house, well-intentioned, entirely beside the point. He simply asked if she was hungry. She said yes. He said, "Then come." The rectory attached to the cathedral was not a modest space. Father Dominic's family wealth, inherited from a shipping empire his father had built across 3 continents, meant that even his chosen life of service came with 12 rooms, a housekeeper named Mrs. Okonkwo who had opinions about everything, and a dining table that seated 14. It also, currently, housed his 2 nieces, the daughters of his late brother Emeka, who had died of a sudden cardiac event 8 months prior, leaving behind grief, debt, and 2 young women wholly unprepared for either. Camille was 23. She had her father's jaw and her mother's temper, and she had spent the 18 months before Emeka's death in a pattern that Father Dominic tracked with the grim patience of a man reading a weather forecast he could not change. The parties, the disappearances, the phone calls from numbers he didn't recognize, and behind all of it, the cocaine that Camille treated less like a vice and more like a scheduling tool. She was not cruel at her core. But she was lost, and she had mistaken the sensation of being numb for the sensation of being free. Renee was 21, and she was, depending on the week, a model, an actress, or something Father Dominic had needed Mrs. Okonkwo to explain to him in careful, patient language that left him staring at the ceiling for a long time afterward. She was beautiful in the aggressive, camera-ready way that made people underestimate the intelligence behind her eyes, and she had learned early that beauty, in certain rooms, was a currency that spent faster than money. Their mother, Emeka's widow, had not so much encouraged Renee's choices as celebrated the outcomes, forwarding booking confirmations to the family WhatsApp group as though they were academic awards. Father Dominic had muted that group in February. He settled Sophia into the guest room on the 2nd floor, the one with the window that overlooked the garden, because he believed, perhaps irrationally, that people healing from terrible things deserved to wake up to something green. Mrs. Okonkwo warmed soup without being asked, set a plate of bread beside it, and said nothing beyond, "Eat, child," which was, Father Dominic reflected, probably the most useful thing anyone had said to Sophia in weeks. Later, standing in the corridor outside her room, he heard her murmuring again. The rosary, the same steady rhythm, the words worn smooth by repetition into something that sounded less like prayer and more like the girl simply reminding herself that she was still here. He pressed his palm flat against the door for a moment, the way you might steady a boat. Tomorrow, he thought, Camille and Renee would wake up and find a stranger in the house. Tomorrow there would be questions and complaints and the particular theater of two young women who had grown up with every advantage performing the role of people who had not. Tomorrow would be complicated. But tonight, Sophia was warm. Tonight, she was eating. And Father Dominic Ibarra, billionaire, priest, and the man who stopped for lampposts, walked back down the corridor with the quiet, unshakable certainty that God had not sent him out in the rain by accident. The morning arrived the way difficult mornings often do, bright, indifferent, and entirely too early. Sophia was already awake when the house stirred, sitting at the kitchen table with her rosary coiled in her palm, and a glass of water she had helped herself to with the careful, apologetic precision of someone who was still calculating how much space she was allowed to occupy. Mrs. Okonkwo had found her there at 6, and without ceremony, cracked 4 eggs into a pan. This was Mrs. Okonkwo's love language, and Sophia, who had not been loved in any language for quite some time, received it with both hands. Camille came downstairs at 9:30 wearing sunglasses indoors, which Father Dominic had long accepted as her emotional weather report. She stopped at the kitchen doorway, looked at Sophia, looked at Father Dominic, and then looked at the eggs as though they too required an explanation. "Who," she said, "is this?" It was not a question so much as an indictment, delivered in the flat, practiced tone of a woman who had decided before leaving the room that she would be unhappy about whatever she found. Father Dominic explained, briefly and without drama, that Sophia was a young woman in need of shelter, that she would be staying with them, and that he expected her to be treated with the same courtesy extended to any guest in the house. Camille removed her sunglasses, studied Sophia's rounded midsection with an expression that moved through several stations before settling on something cold, and replaced her sunglasses. She poured herself a coffee and left the room. It was, all things considered, a more restrained response than Father Dominic had prepared for. Renee's reaction came later, and it was louder. She had been on a call when she first learned. Her mother, predictably, had texted the moment Camille reported the situation upstairs, and she arrived in Father Dominic's study with the particular energy of someone who had been rehearsing grievances on the staircase. She was dressed impeccably, as always, in the way that suggested her appearance was armor rather than vanity. She told Father Dominic that the house was not a shelter. She told him that it was inappropriate, that it was uncomfortable, and that people, her people, the kind who photographed her and paid for the images, would have opinions about the environment she was associated with. Father Dominic let her finish. He had the patience of a man who had sat with dying parishioners and fractious parish councils and one very memorable diocesan budget meeting that had lasted 4 hours, and he was not going to be hurried by a 21-year-old, however well-dressed. When she was done, he said, simply, "Your father would have opened the door himself." Renee left without responding. But she did not slam the door, which Father Dominic took as a small, complicated kind of progress. In the weeks that followed, Sophia moved through the house like water finding its level, quietly, steadily, without fuss. She attended the prenatal appointments Father Dominic arranged, accompanied always by Mrs. Okonkwo, who had appointed herself guardian with a ferocity that suggested she had been waiting years for someone worthy of the role. Sophia helped in the cathedral's community kitchen on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, not because anyone asked her to, but because she had walked past it one afternoon, seen the queue of people waiting for a hot meal, and simply gone inside and picked up a ladle. Father Dominic had arrived to find her serving jollof rice to a line of 30 people, her movements careful around her growing belly, chatting with an elderly man about whether his late wife's pepper soup recipe could be reconstructed from memory. He stood at the door and felt something shift in his chest, the particular feeling of watching a person reveal who they actually are when no one is performing for them. Meanwhile, Camille's evenings grew longer and less accountable. Father Dominic found a small plastic bag in the bathroom she used, tucked behind the mirror with the optimism of someone who believed that a thin pane of glass constituted concealment. He sat with that knowledge for 2 days before he spoke to her, not with anger, but with the steady, sorrowful directness of a man who had buried her father and was not prepared to bury her too. Camille cried. It was the first genuinely unguarded thing he had seen from her since Emeka's funeral. She promised to try. He believed her, the way you believe someone who is standing at the edge of something and reaching back for your hand, not certain, but reaching. Renee's situation crystallized on a Thursday evening when Father Dominic received a phone call he had not been anticipating, from a number he did not recognize, about a situation he had hoped he had misunderstood. He had not misunderstood. He sat in his study afterward for a long time with the phone face down on the desk and his hands flat on his knees, breathing the way his spiritual director had taught him, in through the nose, out through the mouth, and somewhere in the middle, let go of the thing you cannot fix by holding it. The family meeting happened on a Saturday. Father Dominic asked Mrs. Okonkwo to take Sophia to the market, which was both practical and the kindest way he knew to remove her from what was about to become a difficult room. He sat across from Camille and Renee at the long dining table, the one that seated 14 and currently felt like it seated approximately too many, and he told them, with no theater and no preamble, that he was revising his estate arrangements. Sophia would be named primary heir to his estate, his charitable foundation, and the stewardship of the cathedral's community outreach ministry. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. Renee said his name once, sharply, like a door being tested. Camille said nothing, but her jaw tightened in the precise way Emeka's had when he was absorbing something he could not immediately argue with. Father Dominic let the silence sit. Then he said, I have not stopped loving you. I have never stopped. But love is not the same as reward, and I will not hand a platform built for compassion to people who have not yet learned to be compassionate. When you are ready, and I believe you will be, I will be here. Asterisk he rose, straightened his collar, and went to find Sophia at the market. The baby arrived on a Wednesday morning in April, small and insistent and entirely unconcerned with the complications she was born into. Sophia named her Grace, not after anyone in particular, but because it was the only word that felt large enough to hold everything the pregnancy had been and everything the birth had become. Father Dominic was in the hospital corridor when it happened, rosary in hand, doing the same thing Sophia had been doing under the archway the night he found her, which struck him later as the kind of symmetry that God occasionally allows himself as a quiet joke. Mrs. Okonkwo wept without apology, and then immediately began planning what Grace would eat once she was old enough to have opinions about food, which was, for Mrs. Okonkwo, the highest expression of love available to her. Camille came to the hospital. She stood at the nursery window for a long time without speaking, looking at Grace through the glass with an expression that Father Dominic could not fully read but recognized as significant, the face of someone being rearranged from the inside. She did not stay long, but she came, and in the architecture of that family, showing up was its own kind of vocabulary. Renee did not come, not that day. Father Dominic noted it without judgment and filed it in the same place. He filed all the things he could not control, alongside the boiler that kept failing and the hymnal argument that had never fully resolved. The years that followed moved the way years do when they contain both grief and growth, not linearly, not tidily, but with the lurching, unglamorous momentum of real life. Sophia, with Father Dominic's guidance and the legal support of the Foundation's trustees, completed her secondary education through a flexible program designed for young mothers. And then, with a determination that made her tutors describe her in terms they usually reserved for students twice her age, enrolled in a social work degree at the City University. She carried Grace to lectures in a sling during the first semester, which prompted exactly one complaint from a fellow student and an immediate, decisive response from the department head that settled the matter permanently. Grace grew into a child of startling sociability, the kind of small person who treats every adult as a potential friend and every meal as a communal event. She She called Father Dominic Uncle Dom, which he had not requested and could not bring himself to correct, and she called Mrs. Okonkwo simply Quo, which Mrs. Okonkwo pretended to find undignified while visibly loving it. The cathedral community kitchen, which Sophia had expanded by the end of her second year into a twice-weekly program serving over 200 people, became Grace's second home. She grew up knowing the names of the regulars, understanding without being told that the man who always took the end seat preferred not to make eye contact, and learning to ladle soup with the focused generosity of someone who had been shown, from her very first breath, that care was something you did with your hands. Camille's turning point came quietly, the way the best ones do. 18 months after the family meeting, she called Father Dominic from a rehabilitation center 3 hours outside the city where she had admitted herself without telling anyone first. Her voice on the phone was stripped of the defensive architecture she usually carried it in, no sunglasses for the soul, nothing between her and the words. She said she was sorry. She said she was trying. She said she did not know if she deserved the trying, which was, Father Dominic told her gently, precisely the wrong question. The trying, he said, is not a reward you earn. It is a door you walk through. You've already walked through it. Keep going. She stayed in the program for 4 months. She came home thinner and steadier and with the particular quality of someone who has looked at the worst version of themselves and decided, carefully, to build something else. She began volunteering at the Foundation's outreach program the following spring. She was not yet healed. Healing, Father Dominic had learned across 6 decades, is not a destination but a practice, but she was present, and present was enough to begin. Renee's road was longer and less straightforward, which surprised no one who knew her, and which she would later describe, in the blunt, unsentimental terms she applied to most things, as asterisk. The most expensive education I ever got, and the only one that actually taught me anything. She had spent nearly 2 years in a cycle of high visibility and private unraveling before a single night in a city she hadn't planned to be in, sitting in an emergency room waiting area at 3 a.m, produced the specific quality of silence that strips a person back to what they actually are. She called her mother first. Then, after a long pause, she called Father Dominic. He answered on the second ring, the way he always did, because he had never once in 5 years stopped expecting her call. The reunion was not cinematic. There was no orchestral swell, no slow-motion crossing of the threshold. Renee arrived on a Tuesday with 2 bags and the careful, provisional dignity of someone who is not yet sure of their welcome but has decided to show up anyway. Sophia made tea. Grace, who was 4 and had never met Renee and had therefore formed no opinions about her whatsoever, immediately presented her with a drawing of what she described as a horse, but which looked considerably more like a cathedral. Renee looked at it for a moment, and then laughed, a real laugh, unpolished and sudden, and something in the room shifted permanently. The dinner that followed was loud and imperfect, and punctuated by Mrs. Okonkwo, correcting everyone's table manners with equal, democratic enthusiasm. Father Dominic sat at the head of the table that seated 14, a table that had spent 5 years feeling too large, and looked at the faces gathered around it. Sophia, pouring water with Grace balanced on her hip. Camille, passing bread to Renee with the careful tenderness of sisters relearning each other. Mrs. Okonkwo, already preparing to argue about dessert. He folded his hands. He did not say grace aloud. He simply held it, the whole improbable, rain-soaked, hard-won, luminous thing, and let it be enough. This story is about compassion and second chances. Like, subscribe, share, comment below. Would you have helped her?